Hey, what's going on everyone? Greg here, and when Apple announced that they were putting an M1 chip into the iPad Pro, my mind was blown. You're telling me that the full-size MacBook Air laptop and the iPad Pro are going to have the same exact performance and be just as capable? My mind was even more blown when a year later, Apple decided they were going to take that same powerful M1 chip and pack it into the cheaper iPad Air. $600 for an iPad with an M1 chip sounds crazy, and in some ways it is, because at this price point, I don't think you can find me a better performing device in the entire market, which makes this iPad one of the best performance values that Apple has ever released. But it comes with one big flaw. First, let's take a step back and go through and look at the design. Now, overall, this is the same exact design as the last iPad Air. It still has reduced bezels, although not as reduced as the iPad Pro. It still comes with a 10.9-inch 60Hz LCD display with 500 nits of max brightness, and it still works with all the same accessories as last year's iPad Air, and of course the 11-inch iPad Pro. So if you want to grab an Apple Pencil and start writing down notes, editing photos, or draw on this iPad, you can. And if you want to turn this into basically a full laptop-like device with an Apple Smart Keyboard or more affordable alternatives, you can do that too. The one design trait they actually fix, at least for me, is the color. Last year I got the blue model and I kinda hated how muted the color was. It kinda just looked like a slightly different shade of silver. And we saw all the bright, fun, vivid colors on the M1 iMac. I thought, when is Apple going to make that same color shine on the iPad? Well, I'm proud to say they finally done it. At least with this new blue model that I picked up, it looks absolutely phenomenal. I know. A color has nothing to do with performance or all the fun stuff like that, or how you use the device, but I just want to applaud this move. Adding more color to the device helps separate it from the iPad Pro lineup, and it's just a fun touch of personalization that, when it's right, it feels like this device was catered towards you. It makes it a lot more personal. But that kind of ends with the color, because there's a lot of the same with this iPad Air. The camera on the back is pretty much the same as last Air, although this time with some upgrades with the image signal processing, which could result in better photos or videos if you're taking photos on your iPad. The front camera is the same as last year's with Apple's center stage camera feature, which features an ultra-wide angle camera that can crop in and adjust the position to keep you or other subjects in the frame. There is some quality loss in the center stage camera, as I think a lot of us have found out after using it on the big 27-inch studio display, but for a webcam, I think I would take that loss in quality. I would rather have this more fun experience than a sharper picture. And it also makes video calls slightly less awkward with the portrait orientation of the front-facing camera on the iPad Air. Perhaps it's time for Apple to rethink that camera position and move it into a landscape orientation. And other things are still the same, like battery life. I feel like this iPad Air kind of gets that same golden standard of around 8 to 10 hours of battery life that you've gotten with previous iPad models. This iPad Air seems to be getting the same exact battery life as the last iPad Air, even with the newer chip. The Air still lacks other features found on the iPad Pro model as well, and it's kind of hard to review the Air without mentioning those loss of features, because at this point, you're basically trying to decide which features you're comfortable giving up to hit this lower price point and to buy this device. So instead of Face ID, there's Touch ID in the power button. Now, Touch ID works fine, but I think Face ID has a much better experience, especially on the iPad, where there's a chance you may use it with an external keyboard. I really love tapping on the spacebar on my iPad Pro, and Face ID instantly scans my face and I'm ready to go. On the Air, when you're using it with a keyboard, you have to reach up, hit Touch ID, and then you've unlocked it. It works, but it's a slower process. There's also one less camera on the back. The iPad Pro has a 10 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and the iPad Pro also has the LiDAR scanner for enhanced augmented reality. Although, to be honest, those are two features I almost never use on my iPad Pro, and I'm just fine giving them up on the iPad Air. I think what the biggest issues will be for most people going between the iPad Pro and the iPad Air is, number one, the display. Because on the iPad Pro, you get a ProMotion display, which gives you an adaptive 120Hz refresh rate. This means that scrolling, animations, gameplay, everything kind of just feels smoother on the iPad Pro. And it makes the iPad seem more responsive and smoother to your touch. Even if technically the processing speed is exactly the same on both models, because the iPad Pro has ProMotion, it just kind of makes it feel faster, even though it really isn't. I also like ProMotion a lot for using the Apple Pencil, where you place the tip of the pencil on the screen, and when you start drawing, it feels like a more one-to-one experience where you're using a real pencil. It feels like the kind of digital ink is instantaneous on the screen, where on the iPad Air, especially if you're moving it very quickly, I feel like you can notice more of that slight little delay. Now, some users might not even notice this at all, and if you've never had an iPad with a ProMotion display, you won't even know what you're missing. Now, another display downgrade is specifically if you compare it to the 12.9-inch iPad Pro with its mini LED display. Now, this might not be a fair comparison, but the mini LED display on the 12.9-inch iPad Pro is just beautiful. It gives you much deeper black levels, and you can hit 1600 nits of peak brightness, giving you a really nice HDR movie watching experience. And if you're the type of person that consumes a lot of movies on your iPad, I'll raise my hand as being guilty, that display is just really, really, really nice. But that 12.9-inch iPad Pro is almost double the price of this iPad Air, so it's really not a fair comparison. And there's still some more features you lose. The iPad Pro gets a better speaker system with its 4-speaker array, and the iPad Air just gets 2 speakers. Now, I think both speakers for tablet speakers actually sound pretty good, but there is more richness and fullness to the iPad Pro, and I just think overall, if you're using those outward speakers, it does a better job, immerses you more in the content. And then lastly on the iPad Air, the USB-C port is not a full-speed Thunderbolt port. Now, it is pretty fast. It goes to 10 gigabits per second, but hey, maybe all those trades are pretty good to make when you consider the price difference between the iPad Air and the 11-inch iPad Pro, because the price difference between both base models is $200. And the big question with this review is the Pro actually worth $200 more than the iPad Air? And in the past, you might give up some other things with this iPad Air, particularly with performance. Performance was always better on the Pro, but this year, it's not. Like I mentioned at the start of this video, the iPad Air comes with the same M1 chip as the iPad Pro, and it's not even a lower bin chip. It's the same 8-core CPU and 8-core GPU, and it doesn't even skimp out on memory. It has the same 8 gigabytes of memory as the 11-inch Pro model. This means that anything the iPad Pro can do, the iPad Air can do. They can't do them better, but it can do them. It just does them the same, which is really, really good. The M1 in the iPad Pro was overkill. The M1 in an iPad Air is even more overkill, and performance on this device is just insane for the $600 price point. I don't think you can find a Windows laptop at $600 that can match the performance in this iPad Air tablet, like a $600 tablet. That is a really good selling point for this device. That's just kind of how crazy this iPad Air really is. But the biggest drawback with the iPad Air, at least to me, is iPadOS, which can still feel limiting even with all the nice additions Apple has made over the years. It still just doesn't feel as productive as any of my Macs, even when attaching Apple's Magic Keyboard, although for some tasks, I do like the iPad's kind of single app focus. I know there's multitasking, I know you can have a couple different windows open, but for the most part, when I use my iPad, I use it in that single app view, and I find that to create a better experience for focusing on a single app. So if I'm trying to write down a script, if I'm trying to read a book or a web page, well, doing that sometimes on the iPad just feels a little bit better. There's less to get distracted with because of the multitasking limitations on the OS. Now, I'm not saying Apple should keep those limitations, and I still want to see proper windowing when connected to the Magic Keyboard. However, on the iPad Pro, where this becomes a big problem, on the Air, it's more forgivable. Some people will buy the Air not with the expectation of buying it to replace their laptop, and will use it just as a tablet where iPadOS really shines. And if you do buy this as a laptop alternative or replacement, if you spend your budget wisely on third-party keyboard options, you could make the argument that for around $600 to $800, there's not a Windows or a Mac machine on the market that would give you the performance or as smooth of an experience as this iPad Air. Again, the M1 at $600 is quite frankly a steal. But there's always a catch, isn't there? And the Air is no exception. Now, it isn't the display, the speakers, the USB-C port, or whatever else we talked about that it doesn't have on the iPad Pro. It's the starting storage of the base model. 64 gigabytes of storage with all the power and capabilities of the M1 chip is just so artificially limiting that it boggles my mind why Apple does not start this device at 128 gigabytes. I mean, think about it. The M1 has been out for over 2 years now, and no device with an M1 chip has ever shipped with anything below 128 gigabytes of storage until now. Already with my base model, even after just a week of using it, I have filled up my iPad Air and had to delete games, apps, and just other things that were on my previous iPad to fit it all on this device. The worst sin to me is the price ramp up to upgrade your storage. There is no middle option for a 128 gigabyte upgrade like you can do with the iPhone SE, which would just be a $50 upgrade. And while in a perfect world for $600, you'd get a 128 gigabyte base model and it would be amazing, in this world, you should at least be able to spend $50 more to get 128 gigabytes. $650 for this with an M1 with 128 gigabytes is still a really good deal. I don't know why Apple is really limiting that option. Maybe it's to prevent on more SKUs to keep the iPad Air cheaper, but I feel like I'd rather have 64 and a 128 gigabyte option rather than the next option, which is to go 0 to 60, or rather 0 to 150, and put 256 gigabytes on the Air. That's a $150 upgrade, which just puts it within $50 of price difference between the Air and the Pro. And that's the real tragedy with this iPad Air, because you have a difficult decision to make. I think for most iPad users, 64 gigabytes is just a bit too tight to be comfortable using, not only for today, but for the next 5 or more years. You would expect this device to work. It could be fine today, but growing into this device will be tricky. While 128 gigabytes, double the storage, would give you some comfortable breathing room. And I think for most users, that's actually the sweet spot for the iPad Air. 256 gigabytes, while even more, quite frankly, could be more than what most users need, making you spend extra money on storage that you might never use. And the iPad Pro comes with 128 gigabytes of storage on the base model. So, if you're upgrading storage, if you need 128 gigabytes, do you get an iPad Pro with a better display, better speakers, Face ID, better cameras, a Thunderbolt port, at just a $50 upgrade from the 256 gigabyte Air? Yeah, I don't know what the correct answer is either. It's a really, really hard choice. So I don't blame you in being confused. Honestly, I'm a little confused. It's why I'm struggling so much with this review, because if you really make this 64 gigabyte model work, and to me, that sounds very, very hard. You need to be limited on your apps, you need to be limited on how many movies or games you can download to this device. I can't foresee this being a competent video editing machine, but maybe that's not who the Air is for. If you deal with cloud storage or somewhere to offload that storage and you don't need that much, for $600 with the M1 chip, if you can make the 64 gigabytes work, it's a steal. It would just be a ridiculously good iPad at that price point, and there would be little justification to spend $200 more on the Pro. But at $749, the choice becomes less clear, and you really need to balance out features with storage, because for some, the iPad Pro becomes the better choice. But anyway, I really hope this video helped you out, and if it did, consider leaving me a like. If you want to see more from the channel, make sure you're subscribed, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care, everyone.